I do very much hope that you brought 2 handouts today. They are nicely named 5 and 5A, so it kind of indicates that they go in parallel. One of them is just some copies from the big blue book, some plane and space groups, while the other one is actually some slides that are trying to explain these things. And we'll be talking about these plane group and space group explanations today, just to try to clarify all these crystallographic conventions that you will have to deal with. You've already learned a few of them. You've already learned to clarify a few of them, and we'll be dealing with them a little bit more. Now, actually, before we really get into this one, let's take a step back. Quite a few people came to ask me questions about the entries in these plane and space group symbols. Now, as you probably saw on this slide, one of the first things you find on all the pages in the big blue book is actually a symbol that looks kind of similar to the things we've dealt with, right? This one starts with a capital letter, so that tells you it's a space group, not a plane group. But a lot of people were still kind of uncertain about all these entries in there and where they come from, what they mean. And these symbols are really, really powerful. To a crystallographer who knows their crystallography, that symbol tells you a lot of things. Homework? Homework? As a matter of fact, I can look at any of these space group symbols, okay, and all I need to see is that space group symbol, and I'm going to tell you what the crystal system is. How many of you here can do that at this time? None of you, right? Because you haven't spent enough time with these symbols. But is that something that sounds like a pretty good thing to be able to do if you really deal with crystal systems? Yeah, right? So how do we do that? Well, first of all, what are these symbols? All of the space group symbols are a capital letter followed by between 1 and 3 entries. Okay? The first thing is a capital letter, which will be one of these. Okay? P, R, I, F, C. In a few cases you may see a B or an A, but those are non-standard settings. You'll learn today a bit more about what that means too. And then we have between 1 and 3 entries. And just by looking at this combination of things, the crystallographer can figure out what the crystal system is. Alright, well, let's have a closer look at that. Does anybody remember any of the crystal systems? What do we have? Cubic. Orthorhombic. Hexagonal. Monoclinic. Tetragonal. Rhombohedral. Triclinic. So these are 7 crystal systems. Very good. Now, what do these 7 crystal systems show us in the space group symbols? Triclinic is really simple, because what kind of symmetry can we have in that system? Really not a lot, right? The only thing we can have is an inversion center. So triclinic always has a P, and the only entries that follow that symbol are either a 1 or a 1 bar. What that means is there is no rotations in triclinic, okay? The reason for that is there are no 90-degree angles. So there can't be any rotations. Monoclinic, can we have rotational symmetry? It has some 90-degree angles, right? So we can have rotational symmetry. But how many 90-degree angles do we have? 2 of them, right? So in one certain direction, both of the angles that we look at are 90 degree. In all other directions, there's an angle that isn't 90 degree. If an angle is not 90 degree, how does two-fold rotation look? Not good, right? Because the unit cell wouldn't go onto itself. So, we have a two-fold rotation, but only in one direction, okay? Monoclinic space groups, what you will often find is a P or a C, okay? They can be base-centered. And this is a short way of summarizing what a monoclinic space group symbol looks like. There's usually one entry, and all kinds of rotations that could be in there are smaller than 3. That means 2, obviously. And there could be, mirrors and glides and stuff like that. That's possible. But there's usually one entry. If there's more than one entry, a bunch of them read 1, okay? But there's only one non-1 entry in that space group symbol. Orthorhombic. Looks like a brick, right? So, what do we have? All angles 90 degrees, so we can have rotational symmetry in all 3 directions, right? And that one, as a matter of fact, can have a whole bunch of centering symbols, right? If you think back to our original Bravais lattices, orthorhombic was the only system that has all types of centering. Now orthorhombic, you always need to specify all 3 directions, because it will have at least some kind of rotational symmetry in all 3 directions. For some mirror, okay? There's always symmetry in all 3 directions in the orthorhombic crystal system. So you cannot leave out any entries because there's symmetry in those directions. Monoclinic, our symmetry entry refers to what we call the unique direction. And what that boils down to is there's one angle that is not 90 degree. And that defines a unique direction. Okay? Beta in the conventional setting is not 90 degree, then anything looking down the B axis will actually have the symmetry. Nothing looking down the A or C axis will have rotational symmetry. Orthorhombic, you have symmetry in all 3 directions. So your entries correspond, because we like the alphabet, to the X, Y, and Z, or A, B, and C direction, whether you call it by the conventional mathematical names or by the crystal axes, A, B, and C. Once again, none of the rotations can be higher than twofold in a brick. Okay? So all of these entries, they can have mirrors, they can have glides, but when it comes to rotations, they cannot have anything higher than a 2 in there. Next system is rhombohedral. As a matter of fact, you find two symbols here, P and R. R is a special symbol for the rhombohedral setting. Okay, P would once again refer to some primitive setting. What's the distinguishing feature? How I immediately recognize a rhombohedral space group? The first entry is a 3 or 3 bar. If I see a symbol followed by a 3 or a 3 bar, I know it's rhombohedral. We sometimes also call this crystal system trigonal. Okay? That actually makes a lot of sense if you then look at the 3. The highest rotational symmetry is threefold. And yes, all rhombohedral systems have threefold symmetry. There are no rhombohedral systems that don't have the threefold symmetry. There could be one entry. There could be a couple of entries. The one thing that doesn't change is that you have that 3 or 3 bar. So that is really how you recognize it. Okay? So that's the trigonal one. If you have a P setting, you usually have 1 or 3 entries. If you have an R setting, you usually have 1 or 2 entries. But those are some more involved details. When it comes to recognizing the crystal system, all you have to watch for is this one. Okay? Tetragonal. What can we have in tetragonal? You can certainly have a P, and you can have an I. So you might recall from our little drawing, base centering, face centering do not work in tetragonal because we could make a smaller unit cell with the same symmetry. What do you think the first entry here will be? As a matter of fact, we should probably also allow for certain entries like this. 3 sub 1, 3 sub 2, okay? But something with a 3. And the same holds true here. It could be screw axes, could be a 4 sub 1, okay? But there will be a 4 as part of that first entry. The moment you see a 4, you have a pretty good chance that it's tetragonal. Okay? Is it always? No, there are a couple of cubic things that could kind of screw with that too. If there's only one entry, it is most certainly tetragonal. Okay? You won't have a symbol followed by a 4 that does not have something else following it if it is not tetragonal. P4, I4, those things, there could be entries. Now, most of the time you will find more entries. In most cases you will find 3 entries, like so many space groups. And this starts to be an interesting system, okay? The first entry refers to along the C-axis, because that's our special axis, right? A and B are identical in a tetragonal system. C is different. So our 4-fold symmetry will be along the C-axis. So we don't go X, Y, Z or ABC anymore. We start at the back end, but that's just because of the convention of what the unique axis is. How about A and B? They're the same thing, right? So the second entry in that symbol will refer to both the X and Y direction. Because whatever kind of symmetry you have along the X direction, you also have along the Y direction. And part of that goes back to your fourfold. You got a fourfold. Anything that is happening in this direction better also happen in this direction, or your fourfold symmetry breaks down. Okay? Symmetry does not just apply to the atoms, also to your symmetry operations. If you find a mirror somewhere and it goes through a rotation axis, that rotation axis will generate additional mirrors. So the second entry is along X and Y. The third entry would actually be diagonally across that square footprint. So it's no longer along a unit cell axis. Hexagonal. What do you think? 6. 6 is a good one. Once again, 6, 6 bar, 6 up 1, 6 up 2, 3, you name it. Something with a 6. All hexagonal cells have a 6 as the first entry after the centering symbol. For that matter, the centering symbol in hexagonal is always P. There are no centered hexagonal cells. Okay? Could have one entry. Could have 3 entries. Once again, similar to some of these others in that respect. Which leaves us with cubic, right? Cubic can be P, can be face-centered, can be body-centered. And cubic is once again one of those things that can have different numbers of entries. But it cannot have only one entry. It will have 2 or 3 entries. Okay? So if you have a space group symbol that only has one entry, it's not cubic. And that first entry could be a heck of a lot of things. And that is where life often gets confusing for people. Because they expect to see a nice rotation there. Well, there could be some kind of a glide plane or mirror or something like that written on the first position. There could be a rotation written. There could sometimes be only a 2-fold rotation written there, which really starts to confuse people because they say, what's that doing? So how do you really recognize a cubic cell? In this case, the second entry is the most important. It's always a 3 or 3 bar. And that's why I said the moment you see a 3, you're only done assigning your crystal system if it is the first entry. If it is the second entry, it's actually cubic. Okay? Now, one of the good questions is, what are the symmetry directions of these symbols? Right? What would usually be our first guess for where the first symmetry entry is? Along some unit cell axis, right? Yeah. In the cubic system, along which axis? Is there a difference between A, B, and C? So can I really distinguish them? No, I can't. Very good. So, A, B, and C are identical, which means that first entry refers to symmetry along A, B, and C. All three of them. The second entry obviously can't be along a unit cell axis because we are done with our unit cell axis. We have none of them left, right? What that one refers to in a cube is the body diagonal. So you take one point, one corner, you go through the center of the cube and you come out again at the opposing corner, okay? That is what the second direction is. And the third direction would once again be at 45 degrees to your unit cell axis. That would then be similar to what you see in the tetragonal system. One system that is interesting in this respect is the rhombohedral one. For all of the other ones, our first entry is along some unit cell axis, right? Well, for triclinic we really don't have much of an entry. For monoclinic, we said it's along the B axis. Orthorhombic, the first one would be the A axis, then we have the B, the C axis. Tetragonal, our first entry is the C axis, the unique axis, same for hexagonal. Cubic, it's ABC. How about rhombohedral? If you actually work with the standard rhombohedral setting, which is A equal B equal C, all angles identical but not 90 degree, okay? Then your first entry is not along one of your unit cell axes. Your first entry is along the body diagonal, similar to the cubic system, because remember how we said rhombohedral is really a stretched or a squished cube? So that is what that 3 stands for. Now sometimes people translate a rhombohedral cell and give it in what is called a hexagonal or trigonal setting, where you would have A equal B, not equal C, and a 120 degree angle. In that case, your C axis would be the unique axis, similar to the hexagonal system, okay? So when you translate these things, then it would coincide with one of the hexagonal axes. So, that was revisiting that table that confused so many people the first time they saw it, okay? We've now dealt a little more with these symmetry operations and what they really are and what they mean. And I hope the table makes a little more sense now. Are you going to understand it 100% today? Probably not, okay? But you're a step closer and you can go back to it. So with that, let's actually talk about some of these space groups. As I said, this one is directly from the Big Blue Book. And this is actually what is inside the cover. Okay? And this is kind of, they take one of the space groups, in this case CMM2, and they do an annotated group here. See these little numbers? They explain certain things to you, what they mean. When you really go into the space group pages, they won't explain that to you on every page. So, what are all of these things? Well, first we have the top line here. What do we see there? Starts with a CMM2. What do you think that one is? That is our space group symbol, right? It tells us it is C-centered and the symmetry is MM2. 3 entries. What's the highest rotation? 1, What's our crystal system? How many entries do we have in monoclinic? We're in the right region of the table. It's fairly low symmetry, but we have more than one entry, so it's orthorhombic. Exactly. Well, the book actually tells you, okay. So you could always look it up there. But, yes, we are starting to get to the point where we can recognize these. This is actually what we sometimes call the Hermann-Mauguin symbol, and if anybody really knows how to pronounce that one, you're welcome to explain it to everybody, because I've heard about as many different pronunciations as possible. So we call that one the Hermann-Mauguin symbol. What it really is the standard crystallographic symbol that people use. Okay? So you don't have to remember that name. I'm not going to ask you to write that down on an exam. You should recognize, if you hear something that starts with Hermann, that is the standard crystallographic symbols. The letter indicating the centering, followed by some set of entries that indicate the symmetry of that unit cell. Quick reminder, lowercase letters if you work in 2 dimensions, capital letters if you work in 3 dimensions. Not optional, required. Okay? The entries refer to certain symmetry directions, which we just revisited. The international tables give you a slightly different looking table than what you had for the point groups in your handout. Okay? This is exactly the same thing as what is given in your handout. The difference is, this one gives it kind of with vectors and matrices, whereas the table in your handout just talked about x, y, and z directions. Well, 100 in an orthorhombic system, that's equivalent to the x direction. Okay, so it's just a different way of representing this. This one gives it to you for both 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional groups. Okay, while the point group table that I gave you was actually for 3 dimensions. So that is how we write the symbol. What else do we see from that symbol? Well, there are quite a few more conventions in there, okay? We already talked about the fact that one entry could refer to one or to several directions in the lattice, right? Like in the cubic case, all 3 directions are part of it. One thing that confused some people is how the planes are addressed there. None of us have a problem with rotation axes, right? There's an axis, I'm given a direction, I can handle that. Given that a plane would require that you define 2 directions if you really talk about the plane itself, all planes in crystallography are represented by their normals. Okay? Because if I tell you this is normal to the plane of the table, then you know how to draw the table, right? Anything that is at a 90-degree angle to this axis will be part of the plane of the table. So, crystallographers define planes by their normals. And that is why if you have an entry, like in this group that we used as an example, CMM2, what this first entry means is there is a mirror perpendicular to the x direction. Okay? That is what this entry means. It's not a mirror somewhere along x, because what's somewhere along, right? That wouldn't be a good definition. So it's perpendicular to x if it is written on the x position. Whereas this 2 would be a twofold along the z-axis, because it's an axis. Place where life gets interesting is sometimes we have both, right? We have a rotation and we have a perpendicular mirror plane. How many people found that in the homework? One time or another. Yeah, those existed, right? So, how do we represent that? we need to make clear it's along the same direction, right? Because otherwise, if we make an additional entry, we change what direction this is referring to. And that is where crystallographers use this slash that sometimes confuses people. What it is basically you have a rotation axis and a normal to a plane that are parallel. Okay? Or a rotation axis and a perpendicular plane. It's the same thing. And in that case you use this slash to indicate this is part of the same position. And sometimes people write it as a full fraction, okay? So you would write the 2 divided by m. Either one is acceptable. But that is what that slash refers to. And theoretically, you could write 1/m instead of m. Okay? Is anybody going to do that? No, we are too lazy to do so. Okay? Now, in a monoclinic cell, you would find something like this. P2 over m. Okay? Because you would have to indicate that both sets of symmetry actually exist. Other times, people may abbreviate. There are some space groups that actually do have additional symmetry. But crystallographers figure, anybody who knows crystallography should recognize that. It's tough for the beginner, okay? So, in certain cells, you will find something that only has 1 entry. Officially, you should have 3 entries if there are 3 directions defined, right? But a crystallographer figures 1s are very boring entries. And so they often don't write them. Now, in a hexagonal group, does it really make a difference whether I write those 1s? No. Because even at this point in time, you should know that a 6-fold symmetry axis means it is hexagonal, right? And all of you were quite good at recognizing that when we talked about that table. And that it has to be along the c-axis. There's no way around that. So, whether I write these 1s or not, if I write P6, there can be no confusion about what that space group is. It's a primitive cell with 6-fold symmetry along the c-axis and no other additional symmetry entries. Whether I write those 1s or not, that's what it is. And that means that most crystallographers will never write those 1s. There are other symbols that aren't quite as straightforward, okay? That one, I think you guys can handle at this point in time. There are some other ones. You may have somebody write PNMA. As a matter of fact, almost everybody will write PNMA. That's not all the symmetry that is in that orthorhombic space group. As a matter of fact, it has 2 1-screw axes in all 3 directions. So, if you wanted to write the full symmetry indications, you would have to write P to 1 over n, to 1 over m, to 1 over a. But if you have these 3 symmetry planes, the n-glide, the mirror, and the a-glide, you automatically will generate these 2 1-screw axes. So once again, the crystallographer usually doesn't bother writing them. This is something that at this point in time you wouldn't be able to recognize, okay? And do I expect you at this point in time to figure out whether there's a 2 or a 2-1 or something else? No. What I do want you to start getting used to is a symbol that looks so nice and simple might have additional implied symmetry elements. Okay? How can you figure out what they are? Well, you can always look it up. Okay? You can find what these full would be. Now, all of that was about that first line on this page. And for that matter, we aren't even done with that first line. That's scary. isn't it? Looks like such a nice short line, and there's so much information in there. Another thing here is there's some symbol here that might remind some people a little bit of group theory if they ever took it. It looks a bit more strange, crazy, complex, whatever you would like to call it. There were some old notations that used this one, okay? Nowadays, hardly anybody uses them. If you find some really old papers, you may encounter something like this, okay? So just be warned. There could be symbols like that still out in the printed literature. I don't expect you to recognize what these exactly mean, okay? If necessary, you can go to the big blue book and figure it out. They are in there. So it does allow you to correlate them to what you're getting used to in this class, okay? It does give you the point group symmetry over here. Right? Point group symmetry never has a centering symbol. And it actually tells you what the crystal system is. Okay? This one is actually called the Schoenflies symbol in case you really want to know. Then we go to the second line. The first entry here is something very useful. Once again, it looks very innocent, may not even look useful. It's the space group number. Okay? Space groups are numbered from 1 to 230. 1 is the lowest symmetry, so that's P1. 230 is the highest symmetry. The nice thing is, there are often a lot of space groups where, on first glance, you're not really sure which one is the higher symmetry. Okay? If I gave you the cubic space groups PA3 bar and P213, I don't think any of you could say, oh, that one is the higher symmetry, right? You may recognize them as cubic because the second entry is the 3. But which one is higher symmetry? So where in that long area of cubic space groups do you find that stupid space group? Okay? You could be flipping through a lot of pages. Now if somebody tells you this tiny little bit of information, it's not going to take you very long to find that space group in the blue book, because all of you can count. Right? So if I told you that one of them is 198 and one of them is 205, you could very easily figure out where to find them. Whereas if I told you PA3 bar, good luck finding it. It would take you a little bit. Okay? I don't think it would take anybody more than a minute to find space group number 198. Agreed? So, very useful little entry. This one is called the full symbol. So for example, if you had space group P2, as a matter of fact, I think I have a copy of that one. So this is one of those that crystallographers tend to abbreviate, okay? P2. Because we say, okay, there's only one entry, highest rotation is twofold, this has to be monoclinic. The full symbol would be P121, indicating no symmetry along A or C, twofold symmetry along B. So it gives you this expanded symbol, just in case that you want to know what is this. For monoclinic space groups, this can actually be useful, because the convention is that beta is not equal to 90 degrees, right? Now, if somebody happens to describe a cell where A, B, and C are all different, alpha is 93 degrees, beta and gamma are 90 degrees. Is that still, just by the shape of the unit cell, a monoclinic cell? It should be, right? Because we have one angle that is not 90 degree, two of them are 90 degree. Is that the setting that they should be using? No. Beta should not be 90 degree, but somebody shows their origin differently, looked in a different direction, and so alpha ended up not being 90 degree. Guess what? In that case, it would be the A-axis that has the twofold rotational symmetry. So, in that case, giving the full symbol would be very important, because I'm working in a non-standard setting. Okay? Now, if I have any honor and decency as a crystallographer, I'm going to convert that cell to a proper standard setting before I publish that thing. But not everybody does. Okay? In that case, the full symbol helps. Alright, the last entry in the second line is Patterson symmetry. We will not worry about that yet. So just ignore it for the time being. We will get back to that later during the class. But at this point in time, we really don't have the background to understand what it is and what it does. Next part is probably what you would be looking at most often. Okay? This should start to look somewhat familiar. Does it? This is what we call a space group diagram. Okay? What does a space group diagram show you? Well, here's some of it spelled out for you. They show the relative locations and orientations of your symmetry elements. Because let's face it, a symbol CMMA gives us some idea, but it doesn't tell us everything, does it? Those drawings tell us a heck of a lot more. And part of that is, as we've started to learn, P2 has a heck of a lot more than one twofold, right? Things like that. So these diagrams really show us all of the symmetry elements. Now, in some cases you could use one drawing and that would be all you need. In most cases you'll see more than one drawing. It gives you more than one perspective. As a matter of fact, this one gave you 3, right? And basically what this one actually does is, it tells you if you use your standard setting, CMM2, because centering, if possible, should be C-centered, right? Then you should be using this diagram. But a brick, once again, people could change their point of view, right? Especially in orthorhombic system. I mean, who says that this is A and not B or C? Once you figure out the centering, you know that you should choose one direction over another, but before you figure that one out, there really is no preference in an orthorhombic system for what your A, B, and C axes are, as long as you have a right-handed system. So if you happen to choose a different direction, you might have a B or an A centered cell, okay? In which case, your view would look a little bit different. All of these are actually the very same thing. Believe it or not. They look very different. But they are the very same set of symmetry operations. It's just that depending on from which side you look at them, you use different symbols, because either something is perpendicular to the plane or it's in the plane. Here are a whole bunch of twofolds. And these are easy twofolds to spot, right? All of us recognize these by now. Here are the same twofolds if you flip that cell by 90 degrees. Because now they're in the plane of the paper. So we use little arrows to indicate them. That is the symbol for a twofold in the plane of the paper. An arrow. Okay? So, that would be an important one. The other thing that you see here is some of them have little numbers next to them. Now what's that all about?
Distance.
There's a distance involved. Yes. What kind of distance? Has to be somehow translated. Well, the problem is this is a projection, right? All of these space group diagrams are projections. So a good question is, are things in the plane of the paper or are they not? Because it's a three-dimensional cell. Remember, it's three-dimensional for space groups. So there's a difference with respect to whether or not this thing is in the plane of the paper or it's not. These here, if you flip this cell on the side, they're not going to be in the plane of the paper, right? They'll be translated. As a matter of fact, translated by 1/4 of a unit cell. And so that is what is given here as a little number. Now this is already one of those conventions that crystallographers once again use without even thinking about it, okay? Symmetry elements that lie above the plane of projection are designated by the height h above the plane. Okay? That's what that number just was. The other thing to keep in mind is h is given as a fraction along the lattice direction. You won't find something that says 2.1 angstroms, 3.5 angstroms. You'll find a quarter. What does that mean? Whatever the length of the unit cell is in that direction, take a quarter of it and translate that far. So crystallographers use fractional numbers all over the place. You'll meet that again over and over and over. Okay? We use fractional coordinates for symmetry elements, for atoms, for everything. Why is that? Because everything is relative to the size of the unit cell. Okay? If I took a solid at minus 100 centigrade, I took the same solid as at plus 500 centigrade. My absolute numbers would change because of expansion. But if nothing changes about that solid, everything is going to be expanding the same way. My fractional coordinates will not change at all. So the fractional coordinates give me a reference system that is less biased towards the exact material, the exact conditions. And it allows me to compare things. So that's why we use fractional coordinates all the time. As I said, most crystallographers are so used to them, we don't even think about explaining it. While everybody else is sitting there thinking, where the heck does that number come from? Okay? Now you know. You're getting initiated. Fractional coordinates. Now, usually our projections are along a unit cell axis, okay, and that makes sense, right? I mean, that's our perspective, that's our reference system. The only exception to that is a rhombohedral cell could be given where your projection is not along a unit cell axis. That's the one down here. There would be an origin, and you would have A, B, and C axes, none of which are perpendicular to the plane of the paper. Obviously not, or you wouldn't see a line drawn, right? None of them are in the plane of the paper either. This is something that is tricky. If you have non-90 degree angles, there will be things that are not in the plane of the paper. How do you indicate that? You add a little p for projection. Okay? Might be difficult to see here, but you should be able to clearly see it on your printout. Whenever you see a P there, that means this is a projection. This is not in the plane of the paper. As a matter of fact, this P2 that we looked at before Okay? Depending on which direction you look at it, here's one. So obviously the c-axis is pointing into the plane of the paper here. The b-axis is pointing this direction. This is the direction of the a-axis, but it shows you this one is not in the plane of the paper. Okay? Because if we have the c-axis pointing down, A and C are not at a 90-degree angle. Because beta is not 90 degree. Okay? So you just have this little symbol P added, which stands for projection. Now, for a rhombohedral cell, there's a reason why people might draw it like this, because there are no 90-degree angles, but it's still pretty high symmetry, right? So they give the projection down the body diagonal. However, this one also shows you what we've already hinted at. There is a so-called trigonal or hexagonal setting of the unit cell axes. Okay? This one gives you both. This would be the rhombohedral setting, and this one would actually give you the hexagonal axes, as they are called. And it very much looks like a hexagonal cell, 120 degree between A and B equal length. However, your highest rotational symmetry will be 3-fold, not 6-fold. So, that's a little bit about the space group diagrams. And of course, as I said before, you will have to learn those symbols, okay? You need to be able to look at something like this, interpret it. You need to be able to look at a drawing of something and add these symbols. So do make sure that you practice them. 2 folds, perpendicular and parallel to the plane of the paper. Solid lines are what? Mirrors. These kind of dashed or dotted lines are glides. Very good. You are getting there. What's this symbol? The mirror in the plane of the paper. And there could be glides in the plane of the paper, okay? The little arrow just means there's a translational component. So this stuff, yeah, it's a little more in depth than what we've done so far, but you've kind of gotten familiar with that. The last thing that is here is this one. And that's a little bit new for you. Okay? But you will be asked to use these. So we'd better figure out what they are. And that looks like a rather confusing thing the first time you see them, because it's kind of looks like chicken scratch maybe, or you're not really sure what it looks like, right? But this thing would actually allow you to generate these space group diagrams, okay? Which means there has to be a lot of info in there that we don't see on first glance if you don't know what we are talking about. So, let's actually figure out what we have there. Let's use the board for that. And if anybody wants a refill of tea or coffee, get one. You do want to be awake for these balls. So what you find there are these little circles, okay? And I call them balls because they should be three-dimensional objects, right? We are working in 3 dimensions. If I call them a circle, then they are 2-dimensional. You could draw something much more complicated there. Problem is, it gets more difficult to draw, gets more confusing. So we choose something simple, okay? Now this is not a ball, obviously, because this is actually a chiral object to the crystallographer. Okay? something to keep in mind. These symbols, as simple, easy and symmetrical as they look, are chiral objects. So how do I indicate chirality? I mean, that doesn't look very chiral, does it? Even with bad drawing skills, it usually doesn't look very chiral. Here's the convention. This is the other-handedness. I put a comma or teardrop or whatever people want to call it inside. And yes, that is not what we would immediately expect, right? Because we know chiral means mirror image. This sure doesn't look like a mirror image, I agree. But it distinguishes them. It makes it easy to distinguish them. And if you were on an exam and you were expected to, distinguish these things, it would be much tougher. It would be much easier to make a mistake, right? So we just leave one of them blank and one of them gets the comma in it. That indicates a change in handedness. Do remember that. You will need it. What you basically get in these space group drawings that have these objects in them is there will be a corner of the space group, okay? And it doesn't even matter what the symmetry elements there are. And there is a ball inside here. And it usually has another little symbol next to it. Either a plus or a minus. As a matter of fact, it seems that what they put inside the corner here is that. Okay? So it's an object that has a certain handedness. And then there's this plus, which, if you've never seen it, makes people go like, what? What the heck is that? It seems to make no sense, right? Now what this refers to is, it's an object, and this could be an atom, a molecule, could be anything, okay? In what we call a general position. Okay? And that's another crystallographer's term that seems strange. A general position basically means it's not sitting on top of a symmetry element. That's all that general position means. Now, why is that an important distinction? Yes. There are objects that do sit on top of a symmetry element. Yes. What happens to them when the symmetry operation is applied? They are not changed, right? Remember when we talked about point symmetry, we said there's at least one point that is left unchanged. So if you had an atom, a point atom, and it was sitting on a symmetry element, you would not make another atom by using that symmetry element, right? So that's what the general position refers to. It's not on top of a symmetry element. So all symmetry operations will operate on it. Okay? Now that generally means it's not sitting where any coordinate is 0. Okay? Because we have a lot of symmetry along unit cell axis, unit cell faces. We know that. And that is where this little plus comes in. This plus simply means it's not sitting in the plane of the paper. It's sitting somewhere above, because remember, we give the height above the plane as a little number next to an object. Now we could of course write a number there, but given that it could be any arbitrary height, it could be sitting at 0.1, at 0.05, at 0.13, it could be sitting at 0.87, it doesn't matter. So we just indicate with a plus, it's sitting somewhere above. And it's kind of like using an x in math, okay? It's a variable. You could plug a number in. But alternatively, you can just leave the unknown there. Now, yes? Well, x could be a negative number, right? So it could actually in reality be below. But just for imagining it, what I usually do when I have to imagine this is I assume this is slightly above the plane of the paper. That is what I assume that plus indicates, okay? That makes it easier for me to visualize what is going on. Now, if I had a twofold rotation here, it would have to operate on that object, right? What would it do? It would rotate it to here, right? That's what Daniel says. What happens to the handedness? Same. What happens to the height above the plane? It's the same. Not too bad, right? Now this thing had Mn2 symmetry, right? So let's add a mirror plane here. What does the mirror plane do to that one? Next one over here. How about handedness? Changes, so I leave it blank. What about the height? Stays the same. And of course we have to do the same down here, right? For that matter, the mirror makes this one into that, the twofold makes that one into that. And that already shows you that there's an additional mirror running this way, just looking at these four objects, right? So that's the nomenclature of these objects. Now, other example. Let's do a twofold in the plane of the paper. What happens to it? First of all, there should be another object at the same distance from the twofold, right? The height changes. What does the height change to? The same amount below the plane as it was above before, okay? So now you see where the plus is useful. How about handedness? Stays the same, so I need to add the comma. Another way to imagine this is, here's my object, okay? There's my twofold. If I rotate this object around the twofold, I'll have something that is pointing in the board. Does that help? And then you get the minus. It's pointing the other direction. And trust me, you'll get more practice with these. Now, one thing that we still need to address is, what happens if I add this thing? Now life gets confusing, right? Because where does this ball go? Kind of onto itself but behind itself, right? It changes handedness and that plus goes to a minus, right? But where do I draw it? So what the crystallographer then does is this. So if you ever see one of these really confusing things that almost looks like somebody's dealing with moon phases or something, that basically means there are two objects right behind each other. One of them has this handedness and is above the plane. One of them has the opposite handedness and is below the plane. Okay? That is how we would indicate them. All of them would of course be like that with this one. Okay? It obviously operates on all of the objects. So that's that last part of the space group diagram. Okay? The one that you hadn't encountered yet. Why are these useful? For example, they immediately show you whether you have a centered system or not. Right? This group of objects also appears in the center. You got a centered cell. You will be asked to do these, to draw these, to play with them, to explain them. Yes?
What if, in this case, the dots are on the other side?
What dots?
I see dots.
These?
Yeah, the outside dots when you're pointing inwards.
What do you mean pointing inwards?
Meaning, if you have, you want me to draw on board?
You mean if I put a symbol down that was like this?
No. Say if you have all that. That would be one of the pluses. Okay. But
see, the whole thing is
hard to see. I thought
at the moment it's printed, okay?
Yes. Okay.
People have bad handwriting, okay? That is one of the reasons why we don't do two different symbols for two different handednesses. There's something in that object, it's one-handedness. There's nothing in that object, it's the other handedness. Okay? And so if one of you doesn't make the most beautiful comma, but the thing looks more like this, or it's a little bit shorter or something, I still recognize it's a change in handedness. So that's the nice thing about this notation. Okay? There's something in that object, it changed the handedness. I really don't care how it looks, okay? And of course the pluses and minuses instead of numbers or x's once again go back to, oh yeah, crystallographers like to be lazy when it comes to these things. Or efficient, depending on how you look at it. Okay? So, these are important. Make sure that you know they will come back at you on your next homework, okay? I can promise you that much already. We will be practicing them because they are important. What else are you given here? Well, below the space group diagrams there's quite a bit of writing. And these are things that can be very useful. One here is, it tells you where your origin is. And we had some discussion about that, didn't we? Last class, when we had the drawings up, where we looked for symmetry elements and for unit cells, several people asked me, well, this person drew this unit cell. Couldn't I move it? And I told you on Monday, today you can draw your unit cell wherever you want to. Because we hadn't talked yet about how to choose our origin. Are you going to be able to draw your unit cell wherever you want it in the future? Nope. There are actually rules for how to choose an origin. And they are fairly simple. This looks like a lot, okay, but they really are fairly simple. If you have a centrosymmetric space group, you always use an inversion center as your origin. That's simple enough, right? You got an inversion center, you put the origin on it. I think we can handle that. If you have a non-centrosymmetric space group, so you don't have an inversion center, you choose the point of highest symmetry. And that may sound confusing initially because you're like, oh my god, there are so many symmetry things. What is the highest? It's not that difficult. First thing you look for is highest rotation axis. Okay? You find a 6-fold, guess what? You found your origin. There isn't going to be anything higher than that. For that matter, for the things that had 3 and 6-fold symmetry, how did you guys usually draw your unit cell on Monday? You used those symbols, right? Because it was easy to spot them and to connect them. So even without knowing the rules, you followed some of them. So it shouldn't be too tough to figure out your highest rotation axes. What if you have multiple ones? Well, that especially applies to something like, orthorhombic cells. You have 2 folds in all kinds of different locations. Then you look for intersecting symmetry. In the MM2 point, pretty good symmetry, isn't it? 2 mirrors and a 2-fold. You have no rotations. You look for intersections of symmetry elements. Okay? That's how you choose your origin. Highest rotation axis is the first thing. You can use a screw axis if you have no simple rotation axes. You don't like them quite as much as the simple rotation axes. Use the intersections of mirrors or glides if you don't have any rotations. There's one exception to that one. P21 to 1 to 1 and related groups. You actually choose your origin to be symmetrically surrounded by the 3 to 1 screw axes. Probably not going to make you look for an origin in that space group, okay? It's just, there is an exception. I'm not going to lie to you that it is always done like that. But in general, all you really need to know is these rules up here. Look for the highest symmetry, and you will find your origin. Now, in a couple of cases, there are several high symmetry sites, okay? In this case, they obviously give you one origin. That's it, okay? I'm actually not sure whether I printed an example where that's not the case. But there will be some space groups, okay, when you open the big blue book, where you find more than one origin choice. And in that case, it would actually tell you origin choice 1 somewhere in this diagram, okay? That can be very important, because you might be working on the same material as somebody else, and you chose a different origin, so it looks different. It tells you how you can translate one cell into the other, okay? So that can be very useful with respect to actually figuring out whether you have the same material as somebody else or not, or the same material that you already made before. So it's something to watch out for if you ever process crystallographic data. Some programs that you use for that have very strict rules about where they expect the origin. You can run into a lot of trouble if you choose the wrong origin. Okay? Because you know about your change in origin choice, the program doesn't. So the program still assumes its origin. I once ran into a problem like that. I prepared the material in powder form. I actually figured out what the unit cell was. I searched the database, and I found a material with different atoms in it that looked very similar, and charge balancing things, it made sense. So I said, oh, okay, I know what my structure is. So I took the atom positions from the database, converted them to what I was supposed to have with my atoms, plugged it into the program, tried to do a refinement, and things did not work at all. I was like, what am I missing? What's wrong? Well, what it turned out to be was this was a space group, I think it was I41AD or something, where you could have more than one origin choice. The database entry happened to not be origin choice 1, which is what the program assumed. So all of my atoms completely got screwed up because they were sitting in very different positions according to what the program thought than what I had actually wanted to enter. Once I realized this, and once I translated everything to the correct origin, the refinement worked just fine. Okay? So you can waste a lot of time if you don't watch your origin choice. I learned that lesson the hard way. And there will be lessons that you will learn the hard way in crystallography. Make no mistakes, that you will not always get everything right on the first attempt. But it gives you these origin choices so you can look them up. The next thing it gives you is a so-called asymmetric unit. And we've kind of touched on that, I think, in handout 3. Okay? What is that? It is the smallest part of space that you need to describe from which you could regenerate the entire space-filling pattern. And that sometimes causes confusion because people say, isn't that the unit cell? Not necessarily. It could be the unit cell, it could be smaller than the unit cell. Because you can have symmetry elements within the unit cell. Okay? For that matter, your asymmetric unit does not always need to have nice 4 edges with parallel edges, okay? It's not a requirement for your asymmetric unit. It could have very weird shapes, especially in some of the higher symmetry cells, okay?
So if it were like a centered object, you can use like a center point instead of using all the points around it?
Usually you don't use the center point, okay? As a matter of fact, you usually start at 0, 0, 0 to do this. Let's take one that is a little more simple for that one. So let's actually go in 2 dimensions, okay? Here's a 2-dimensional object, plane group P3, and it gives you the asymmetric unit. And it gives it to you in something where it defines what the values for x and y could be. And it gives you something here in 2 dimensions, which is why I chose this example. It is a lot easier for us, okay? It gives you where the corners of this asymmetric unit are. And as you can already tell, this thing has 5 corners. Okay? This cannot be a unit cell. Something with 5 corners cannot be translated with 2 or 3 vectors. That's just not possible. But with all these rotation axes, it can actually make a space-filling pattern. One vertex is at 0, 0. That would be right here. One is at 1/2, 0. That would be right there. There's one at 0, 1/2. And then we have these 2 additional ones at 2/3, 1/3, and 1/3, 2/3. So that's about here. I would need a ruler to do it more precise. Okay? But that means that this would be the asymmetric unit. As I said, it can be a very weird shape. Fact of life is, if you describe every single atom inside that weird looking shape, the symmetry elements will generate everything else. Okay? That's what the asymmetric unit is. It can be a lot smaller than your unit cell. P3 is not that high symmetry, okay? If you go to some cubic space groups, these things can look crazy, okay? Some little weird shapes. Basically, most of the time you really don't have to worry too much about these. Fact is, people will give you a very limited set of atoms when they describe a structure, because they don't bother giving you all the atoms in a unit cell. All they describe is an asymmetric unit. And all the programs you will be using know about this. And, basically most of the time your asymmetric unit can be described by mirror planes and rotation axes that are on the boundaries of it. Inversion centers are usually at the corners or on the midpoints of the sides of these asymmetric units. As I said, it can be rather complicated. And I'm not going to ask you to draw the asymmetric unit for FD3 by M for me, okay? That would be a rather crazy assignment. So, that's our asymmetric unit, and it is given to us. In this case, it's a fairly simple one, okay? Basically, along the x-axis, you need 0 to 1/4. Along the y-axis, you need 0 to 1/2. And along the z-axis, you actually need the entire unit cell to describe this one, okay? So that's a pretty simple shape. You can envision it, you can draw it. In other cases, it can be more complicated. The next entry here is they give you symmetry operations. And this is all symmetry operations in some kind of a, matrix form, basically, if you think about it. You always have the identity. Here's a twofold along the z-axis. Here's a mirror in the xz plane. And they just give you the entire set, okay? Now they have some here. They also have something down here for what they call the 1/2, 1/2, 0 plus set. That refers to the centering. Remember, C-centering is a translation of 1/2, 1/2. They look pretty similar to what is up here, except that, oh yeah, there are 1/2 translations on the first and second entry. Okay? So, these are the things that are on the first page of your plane group pages. Most of the plane groups will stretch over 2 pages. And here's a look at your second page. First thing is, it tells you a set of generators selected, which once again is one of those things, the first time you read it, you're like, what the heck are they talking about, right? What this is it takes the 3 translations, 100, 010, 001. That's the unit cell translations, right? And it selects the minimum number of symmetry operations that you need to regenerate everything in the unit cell. So as you can see, it only uses 3 of them. One of them is a translation, and all the little t's indicate translation, okay? And then it says number 2 and number 3, which, if you look back here, oops, a little lower, is the twofold and this one mirror. Between that twofold and that mirror, you would generate all of those objects on the space group diagram. Some of these symmetry operations become redundant. That's when we say you cannot have certain symmetry operations without the other ones also being present. Okay? Could you use another set of generators? Sure. They just tell you what they choose, what they consider the simplest. So that's the first entry here. Oh, actually it's not quite the first entry. They kind of repeat what space group you're in. But we don't really have to discuss that, right? Because we already did. The next thing is a table. And the length of this table depends a lot on what space group you're in. And this table is actually very important. It once again gives you a lot of information. Tells you these are the positions in this space group, okay? And it gives you some coordinates for them, and then it gives you something called reflection conditions. This column, once again, ignore for the time being. We will get there in due time, but we do not know enough yet to really make any sense out of what is back here. It will make a lot of sense once we actually start using it. So, what are the entries here? Well, this one tells you that there are actually several entries here. They are multiplicity, Wyckoff letter and site symmetry. And that once again sounds like a whole bunch of stuff where we really aren't sure what that is, right? Let's start with the Wyckoff letter. Everybody here know the alphabet? In that case, you can handle the Wyckoff letters. Congratulations. What they do is, you take the highest symmetry site, you call it A. You take the next highest symmetry site, you call it B. You take the next highest symmetry site, what should you call it? C, very good. And you keep going until you run out of symmetry. Okay? That's how simple those letters are. The other thing that goes along with that, so basically down here is the A, B, C, D. Obviously they're listed in reverse order, okay? The other thing that goes along with that is a so-called multiplicity. What the multiplicity refers to is, if an atom is sitting on this side, how many equivalent atoms are generated within the unit cell? That's what multiplicity means, okay? An atom that sits on this Wyckoff A side, there are only 2 atoms generated in the cell by all those symmetry operations. The B side also only generates 2 atoms. The C side, however, generates 4 atoms. And the lowest symmetry side, in this case the F side, generates 8 atoms. Okay? Now, remember how we talked about general positions with these objects? The top entry in this table is always what we call a general position. Okay? The entry here will always be X, Y, Z. Arbitrary X, Y, Z, not sitting on a symmetry element. So the entry here for the symmetry element is a 1. That means no symmetry, right? It's not sitting on top of a symmetry element. That was our definition before of the general position, right? So here's your general position, X, Y, Z. What it then gives you is the positions of the equivalent atoms that are generated. So what they did was they applied these generators here, okay, and made these additional atoms. So they give you how X, Y, and Z get transformed by applying the twofold, by applying that mirror. What they don't give you is all of the translations. They just say up here 0, 0, 0 plus whatever is entered here, and 1/2, 1/2, 0 plus all of these. So that's why there are only 4 entries, but it claims that you make 8 atoms. The other 4 are the ones that have the 1/2, 1/2, 0 translation. Does that make sense? An atom that sits on a mirror plane doesn't generate as many atoms because that mirror does not really operate on it. Okay? So, something that sits on a mirror plane only has 4 as multiplicity. Once again, here it tells you what they are. So this is the mirror plane that actually runs through x equals 0. Okay? So any atom that has x equals 0 and arbitrary y and z is sitting on a mirror plane. An atom that sits at 0, 0 and z, anywhere along the c-axis, has even higher symmetry because it's at the intersection of 2 mirror planes and a twofold. So none of those operate on it. The only thing that operates on it is the centering translation. So 0, 0, z only has 1 entry here. Does that make sense? Very useful table when it comes to figuring out where your atoms are, and we will need that for future things that we will be doing once we get back, for example, to that Patterson symmetry that we now skipped. Okay? So, up to there is what you really will be using in these tables. There's more information down here. Okay? Symmetry of special projections, subgroups and supergroups. What sub and supergroups refers to is symmetry related groups. Okay? For example, something where you take out some of the mirrors, or you take out some of the rotations, or you reduce some of the rotational symmetry. That can be very important when you work on an actual problem, okay? Because you may not be sure about the exact symmetry. Or you may do a substitution on something and slightly change the symmetry. So things are still similar but not the same. In that case, these kinds of related groups can be very, very important, okay? Because they allow you to figure out what happens. Or something undergoes a phase transition that is only a slight distortion, okay? As a function of temperature, for example. It often follows these kinds of relationships, especially if it is reversible. They can be very important. However, they are not very easy to understand when you're just trying to get used to crystallography and all these symbols. They are listed here. There is a slide in the handout that gives you a few examples, tells you a little bit about these things. Okay, we will have a look at it. If some of this seems a bit crazy and complex, don't worry too much about it, okay? This is just your first glance at it. I want you to have seen it because maybe you'll encounter a problem in your research where you need it, okay? And then you can go back and start digging. But this is not going to be something that I will expect you to perfectly understand today, okay? So as I said, you use them to describe symmetry-related space groups. A subgroup of another group always contains a set of the symmetry elements that are in the original group, okay? Condition is, of course, if you have a subgroup, it has to be a space group itself, okay? So you can't just arbitrarily remove any one single symmetry element. As we said, certain things have to be combined or cannot be combined. Sometimes you can take away symmetry elements step by step. It may not always be one, it might be a step of 2 or 3, that's fine. And then you can kind of order your space groups in decreasing symmetry. If two things are adjacent, you call them maximal subgroups. Well, this is once again just nomenclature, in case you find it in an article, okay? Here's an example. P21 over C has several subgroups, okay? P21, PC, and P1 bar. Of course, P1 is a subgroup for anything, right? We remove all symmetry. That's easy enough. Now, between P21 and C, over C and P1, there's always going to be some other space group that you first reach. So you would call that a non-maximal subgroup. And people can play these games, order them as chains of, decreasing symmetry. Play with the symmetry elements. Now, question is, how can you reduce symmetry? Well, there are several things. You can remove point symmetry elements. Okay? Like, you take out a rotation. You take out a screw axis. Okay? You go from P1 bar to P1, for example. You take out an inversion center. So you removed a point symmetry element. Okay? We call that translationsgleich, or T. And what it means is translation equivalent. They have the same translational symmetry. They have the same kind of shape of unit cell. Difference is some of the internal symmetry went away. Okay? The other thing you could do is you could thin out symmetry operations, which means you change the length of the unit cell axis. That means your translations change. Okay? If your space group, if your unit cell size changes, then basically you have different translations. You replace a rotation by a screw axis, you have a difference in whether or not the atoms are translated, okay, because screw axis has translation. So you call them K subgroups, which are the same class or point group, but they have different translations. Supergroup is the opposite of a subgroup. This stuff can be important in real life problems. For the purpose of this class, we really won't be doing a lot with it, okay? But it is part of these entries, and you may encounter it at some point in time. So, that is the handout on the space and plane groups. And I gave you some example pages so you can have a look at them, you know, figure out, do I kind of understand what most of these things mean. Some of them are very simple, some of them are a bit more complex, you know, and you just see examples of what could or couldn't be in there. Don't memorize them. Nobody's ever going to ask you to memorize what the diagrams for all of these different plane and space groups look like. I haven't done so, and I'm teaching the class, okay? It's always a good sign. Are there any questions at this point in time? And I'm sure some of them will come up as we go on. Okay, you all know where my office is by now, hopefully. There will be another homework set handed out on Monday. Actually, I might just email it to you beforehand so you have a little more time to look at it, okay? And you will meet some of these things again. You'll meet some of those balls. You'll meet some of those unit cell assignments, things like that, okay? Other than that, I'll see you on Monday.